When you're analyzing your IEPD requirements, it's a good idea to have a formal process for doing so to help you define the requirements and support accurate documentation of the information exchange. Don't just sit down in a room and go, hey, let's figure out what our requirements are and kind of write them down. It's not the way to go about it. You really want to have a formal process for initiating the process of defining requirements, for actually doing the definition of the requirements, for preparing those requirements for the actual design phase, basically making sure they're correct. You want to have those steps written down somehow, at least formally decided upon, so that then you actually go through all those steps. You just don't want to do this thing kind of off the cuff. You really want to sit down and do it right, because if you get the requirements wrong, everything you do after is going to be useless. You really need to get the requirements right. Initiating the requirements process includes preparing and planning for doing the process. Do people have time set aside? Do you have the resources available to do it? Also includes performing an as-is analysis. What is the state of our information now, the state of any exchanges we're doing now? You want to have a base to work from before you start digging into the to-be analysis and what do you want this exchange to do in the future. And then you can start establishing business requirements, which will then drive the technical requirements. Actually defining the exchange requirements involves steps such as eliciting user requirements. Hey, users, what do you need? Now, by users, I don't mean end users. I don't mean people sitting at a computer terminal accessing information from an internal database. By user here, we mean the agencies at either end of the exchange and what kind of information they need at that end. In other words, if I'm the end of the exchange receiving information, I need to say what kind of things I need. And I've actually seen in the real world two different agencies finally talking in a room and finding out what agency 1 was sending to agency 2 was not what agency 2 needed. But because they had never talked about it and because agency 2 had never really been asked what they needed, they were just accepting what they were given. And it turned out there was additional information, or in fact alternate information that they did desperately need, that was actually easier to produce than what they were getting. But they weren't getting it because nobody ever asked them really what they needed. So eliciting user requirements, where users are the agencies receiving and sending the information, is a very important step. You also want to define security and privacy concerns and requirements, and those may come from statutes, those may come from policies, those may come from simple common sense, but especially in the children, youth, and family services community, you really need to define those. You need to know what those requirements are. And with all that in mind, you can start to specify the actual requirements of the exchange, the actual chunks of information that are going to be exchanged, keeping in mind what people need and what people are allowed to send. Preparing the requirements for design means, well, making sure they're right. You want to analyze them. You want to discover and review existing IEPDs and analyze your requirements in view of those existing IEPDs and see what other IEPDs have done. Then you can verify and validate your requirements, passing them by in an iterative fashion past people who know about the exchange, both business and technical, to make sure the requirements are right. So while I've shown this as just a couple of slides, boom, 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 it's really an iterative process. You do your requirements, and then you pass those requirements by people for review, get comments, modify them, get comments, and you go through that until you get them right. You really want to get them right before you start doing anything else. So I just mentioned looking at prior IEPDs and using those to help you both define your requirements and validate your requirements. How do you find those? Well, there's a couple of ways in which IEPDs are reused. One is through repositories. Existing IEPDs can be discovered by searching within IEPD repositories, and there are repositories out there. Where are they? I'll tell you on the next slide. Discovery of similar IEPDs lets you reuse the artifacts in that IEPD. This helps avoid additional cost as well as decrease your development time, but it also gives you another standard to look at, another standard to measure your own requirements against. IEPDs can be reused at multiple levels. You can reuse an entire IEPD, find one out there that does exactly the exchange you need. You can use parts of it. Maybe you take parts of the artifacts, maybe you take parts of the schema, maybe you take parts of the early planning, parts of the modeling, things like that, or even just individual data objects within the IEPD. Here's an IEPD that exchanges 8 types of information, but you don't want all 8, but man, that one chunk of information, that's what you needed to exchange, and these folks already worked it all out. So there's lots of different ways to reuse an IEPD. Right now, there's 3 different IEPD repositories of which I know. The first is the IEPD Clearinghouse. Now, the Clearinghouse contains pointers to IEPDs that people have done and housed elsewhere. So the IEPD Clearinghouse really doesn't hold IEPDs. Rather, it holds records of different IEPDs telling you about them and points you then to where you can get the actual IEPD. The second repository is the NIEM.gov online repository, and it actually contains actual IEPDs. So people upload their IEPDs to the repository, and you can download them from there. It also works as a tool for assembling IEPDs and is the one I recommend for assembling them. And we'll talk about that later in this section when we talk about assembling and publishing IEPDs. But it actually has them online, and you can download IEPDs from it, as well as search for the ones you need. Finally, DHS also has a repository called the Data Architecture Repository, or DAR, and I know no more about it than what I've just told you, but I do know what's out there. It's another repository for IEPDs. It'll be of particular interest if you're in the DHS community. If you're not in the DHS community, well, then it will be of correspondingly lesser interest. But repositories aren't the only place to go to find out about IEPDs that you can potentially reuse. You can also go to various communities. You can look for fellow practitioners. Every few years there's a NIEM training event. It's a big conference all about the NIEM. And you can go there and learn and meet people, and it's a cool thing to do. There's also a LinkedIn group you can go to find out more information about the NIEM and ask questions and get answers and have discussions, things like that. There are NIEM user groups out there. Which ones they are will be dependent on your community, and there may not be one for your particular community. If you're part of the Children, Youth, and Family Services community, I don't think there are any user groups for you yet. If you're part of some of the other communities, though, you may be able to find some. There's the National Information Sharing Standards Help Desk, which is an online resource you can go to. There's a knowledge base there that you can search through, and if you can't find the answers in the knowledge base, you can ask real live help desk personnel who will then try to get you the answers you need. Finally, in some cases, you can go to domain governance bodies. For example, if you're in the Children, Youth, and Family Services community, there's a governance body for that particular domain, and they're a source you could go to for more information about the domain. And if they don't know the answer, well, they can draw upon technical folks like me who can provide those answers. So there's a lot of different ways to find out about IEPDs other than just searching through online repositories.